Hello again and welcome to History Boffin. In video number 2 of our South Africa playlist, we consider the first 200 years of white settlement from 1652 until the mid-19th century. By the 1650s, the Dutch Empire, through its chartered companies, had become the world's dominant trading nation. In Asia, the Dutch had steadily grown, partly at the expense of the Spanish and Portuguese, who after 1580 were unified under Habsburg rule. As well as securing colonies in places such as Jakarta, which was named Batavia, the Dutch conquered Portuguese holdings in India, Sri Lanka and Malaysia. Trade, particularly in spices and silk, was lucrative, and the Dutch landing at the Cape of Good Hope in southern Africa in 1652 was simply about providing a resupply station for ships making the long journeys from Europe to Asia and back again. The man tasked with developing the Cape as a resupply station was Jan van Riebeeck, a Dutch East India Company man with many years of experience in the Far East. He set about building fortifications and infrastructure, as well as plant crops for the purpose of resupplying company ships. There was never a plan to build a substantial presence in the Cape, and even by 1793 there were only 14,000 burghers or white citizens. However, the foundations for a relatively racially defined society were laid during the first decade. Some white company employees were given the status of free burghers and allocated land. In doing so, they forced the local Khoisan to either move further north or accept servant status. Finally, in 1658, the Cape brought in 2 shiploads of black African slaves, and in doing so started a process whereby the Cape's development was dependent upon slave labour. The Dutch colony grew slowly, which was understandable given the small number of whites that arrived on the Cape, and the focus on the colony as merely a resupply station. Khoisan resistance was put down, initially through weapons, and after 1713 through smallpox. By the mid-18th century, the colony was well established and secure. Some burghers had become wealthy and influential, but most burghers lived modestly, often with a handful of slaves and some land for arable or livestock farming. For some, however, opportunities within the immediate vicinity of Cape Town were limited, and this led to many whites adopting a pastoralist or hunter lifestyle, just like the Khoisan, and they started to travel hundreds of miles to secure land. These whites became known as trekboers, migrant farmers, and by the end of the 18th century they had travelled as far as desert to the north and Bantu-speaking tribes to the east would allow. The distinction between the urban, cosmopolitan Cape District and the rural wilderness of the Graaff-Reinet district was marked. It took 3 months to travel from the Cape District to Graaff-Reinet, and it would have been like travelling to a different world. Material comforts were limited on the frontier, and the threats from indigenous tribes, particularly the Khoisan, were very real. To combat this threat, trekboers created groups, armed by the Dutch East India Company, called commandos. They ruthlessly wiped out cattle raiding parties, and soon enough it was customary to kill male Khoisan while capturing women and children to be distributed as bounty. In fact, one identical feature of frontier life, and that at Cape Town, was the dependence on slavery. In 1795, as their war with Napoleonic France developed, the British took over the Cape in order to prevent it falling into French hands. This change of ownership of the colony was confirmed in an 1814 peace settlement. The takeover by the British was of course viewed with suspicion by the Dutch, but initially the governors of the new British colony, senior military men from the landed aristocracy, saw no reason to change the societal structures that had existed in the Dutch-administered territories of southern Africa. In fact, in the 1810s, the British accelerated white encroachment on indigenous lands by forcibly removing the Xhosa, a Bantu-speaking tribe, to enable an 1820 immigration of poor British settlers. The arrival of British settlers further complicated an already complex society, and soon the Dutch began to distinguish themselves with the name Afrikaner. While British governors and the wealthier Dutch landowners had cordial relations, events in Britain would lead to great tension between the two white groups. For some time, British politics had witnessed growing calls for the abolition of slavery. In 1807, the slave trade was banned by Great Britain, and this began the process of emancipating slaves throughout the British Empire. The Cape Colony was slow to embrace anti-slavery practices, with British governors tending to sympathise with the landowners' pleas. But by the 1830s, Cape Colony, like the rest of the British Empire, was dismantling the slave labour system. This was to have significant consequences for the colony and for relations between British and Afrikaners. While the British and wealthier landowners in Cape Province managed to coexist, even cooperate, despite some tension, it was a different story for the poorer Eastern Trek Boers. They resented British rule and what they saw as interference in their way of life. The abolishment of slavery, which was the backbone of the early development of Cape Colony, was contrary to Afrikaner views, and the British also began to replace traditional Dutch systems with overtly British ones. In particular, new representative government gave the vote to Khoikhoi, subject to income level. In the eyes of the British, the Khoikhoi were now part of a distinct group called Cape Coloured people, despite it being an extraordinarily complex group of ethnicities, and they were equal to whites before the law. While this was happening, the race consciousness of Afrikaners was strengthening. In 1857, for instance, the Dutch Reformed Church bowed to pressure and separated white and coloured congregations. Thus, during the 1830s and 1840s, thousands of poorer Eastern Afrikaners packed up and moved further east and northeast in the hope of securing land for themselves that was outside British control. This was the famous Great Trek, which has gone down in Afrikaner legend, and those who participated were known as the Voortrekkers, or pioneers. They took all their belongings, their cattle and their families in the hope of securing the promised land, one governed by Afrikaners, for Afrikaners, in line with Afrikaner beliefs. They created a number of independent Boer republics, of which two emerged as long-lasting and significant: the South African Republic, also known as the Transvaal Republic, and the Orange Free State. In doing so, they moved further into the territory of Bantu-speaking tribes, who themselves were undergoing violent upheaval due to the Mafekane. The Mafekane is the subject of our next video. Let's briefly turn our attention to a source, in this case a newspaper interview with Piet Retief, one of the most notable Voortrekker leaders. Question 1A of Paper 1 in the IB Diploma Programme History course asks students to look at a written source and infer 3 factors, in the case of this question, reasons. However, this is also useful for Cambridge IGCSE and Edexcel A-level students too, as there are source-based questions in both of these curricula. The first inference that can be drawn is the attacks by indigenous Africans. This is because the source refers to the plunder which we, in other words the Afrikaners, have endured. A second inference is that the British were prejudiced against Afrikaners. This is because Afrikaners felt there was unjustifiable odium, in other words, bad-mouthing, by the British, and the Afrikaner point of view was not listened to. Finally, the Afrikaners believed that the colony was going to suffer under British rule, evident in the words, "We can foresee the total ruin of our country." A simple framework for each sentence is provided below. Using it 3 times should see IB Diploma Programme students get 3 out of 3 for the question. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe by pressing the red subscribe button below. You'll easily be able to find new videos to help you with your studies, or simply to enjoy and use to find out more about history.